Hey everyone, and welcome to Brent's Notepad, where ideas become insight. I'm Brent Shelton, inviting you to think deeper, lead better, and live more intentionally. In each episode, I dive into big questions and meaningful ideas drawn from books, research, and real life. In today's episode, we're unpacking Chapter 7 of Exploring Leadership, the second edition written by Richard Bolden, Jonathan Gosling, and Beverley Hawkins. In this chapter, the authors shift from organizational perspectives of leadership to exploring societal perspectives by expanding our leadership horizon to the entire world. In doing so, they invite us to think beyond the walls of companies and institutions and instead consider how leadership plays out in communities, cultures, and global networks. So let's dive in. The authors begin Chapter 7 by distinguishing the difference between organizations and communities. The authors remind us that organizations have goals, tasks, formal structures, and sanctioned authority, which is the world in which we tend to look at leadership, whereas communities, on the other hand, are characterized by informal relationships and are considered to be a place of belonging that transcends economic concerns. Leadership, therefore, in communities is often seen through the concept of localization, which is where initiatives are more specifically tailored to cultural or social contexts, rather than being applied as a one-size-fits-all model. While organizations and communities may seem like polar opposites, what they both have in common is that they rely on trust and belonging that can be gained through social capital. According to Robert Putnam in his book Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community, he describes social capital as the networks and norms of civic engagement that enable members of a community to trust one another. The idea of social capital and its relationship to leadership studies has since been popularized by David Day, 2024, who frames leadership development as an investment in social capital, highlighting the importance of building networks, relationships, and collective capacity, rather than just the skills, styles, and capacities of individual leaders, which is often associated with human capital. However, considering David Day's perspective, this leads us to a question. How do we build social capital in a world that seems to be expanding before our eyes? And this is where the authors introduce the subject of globalization. The process of globalization, defined by Erickson 2007, can be described by three key features. First, increased trade and transnational economic activity. Second, faster and denser communication networks. And third, increased tension between and within cultural groups due to intensified mutual exposure. A great example of globalization at work is the way in which McDonald's has created a very predictable experience for all of their customers. In other words, from here to there, you can expect the same golden arches, the same Big Mac, and the same double quarter pounders with cheese. All right, I bet you're wondering, how does the process or the concept of globalization or McDonaldization apply to leadership studies? Well, the idea or the process of globalization is a great illustration that embodies the perspective that leadership is universal. It also provides us a stark contrast to the idea of localization or localized leadership. In fact, the localized approach to leadership, also known as what the authors call cross-cultural leadership, has begun to catch the attention of a lot of current leaders, and it's generating quite a lot of scholarly interest. Considering the cross-cultural, societal perspective of leadership, the authors point us to the work of Robert House and colleagues, who established the Global Leadership and Organizational Behavior Effectiveness Project, and who have pioneered the ways in which we understand the connection between leadership and cultural practices. Within their studies, House and colleagues have created useful and working definitions of culture and that of leadership. First, they define culture as shared motives, values, beliefs, identities, and interpretations or meanings of significant events that result from common experiences of members of the collectives that are transmitted across generations. And with this idea in mind, House et al. Go on to define leadership as the ability of an individual to influence, motivate, and enable others to contribute to the effectiveness and success of the organizations of which they are members. Now, the authors dig a little deeper into the study of cross-cultural leadership by identifying two prominent research methods, which are known as the etic approach and the emic approach, as seen in Shedlitsky et al. 2017. The etic approach takes an outsider's view, which is often objective, detached, and quantitative, looking for universal patterns, whereas the emic approach takes an insider's view, which is more subjective, engaged, and qualitative, looking to understand culture from within. The reason we are introduced to the etic and emic approaches to leadership studies is not to encourage everyone to become a leadership scholar, but rather they offer us useful tools for when we are learning and practicing leadership in our own lives, particularly through the emic approach. Now, don't get me wrong, both approaches can be useful for growing one's leadership capacity. However, it's often argued that effective leadership demands immersion, as seen in the emic approach, where you are living and working inside a culture. I think a great example of this would be learning a second language, such as Spanish for a native English speaker. While taking a course, studying verb conjugations, and intentional speaking practice can be very effective, it will never replace living and learning Spanish in a place like Spain or Mexico. With this understanding of cross-cultural leadership, the authors introduce the idea of worldly leadership, which, in my opinion, is a way in which we can apply localized or cross-cultural leadership to a broader audience. In other words, worldly leadership emphasizes the need for specific leadership practices that adapt to local conditions. Ones that recognize the world as more like a patchwork of communities rather than a homogeneous organization. And reading this concept in Chapter 7, I was instantly brought back to 3rd grade when I first learned about the melting pot versus salad bowl analogy. And if you're a millennial like me, I am sure this rings a bell. The melting pot suggests that all cultures should blend into one dominant whole. But the salad bowl showed us that each culture could retain its uniqueness while still being part of a larger cohesive community. And to me, that's really the heart of worldly leadership. Leadership is not about coming to a universal practice that melts everyone into one way of thinking or even leading, but instead it's about finding a way to honor the distinct ingredients of each culture while bringing them together into something meaningful and shared. From here, the authors end Chapter 7 by reiterating the importance of context and place for leadership practices, which was really just a neat little bow at the end of the chapter that reminds us that leadership does not happen in a vacuum. Or according to Ray et al. 2004, who says, leadership practices cannot be understood unless they are studied in their natural context where they are embedded in tactic knowledge structures. All right, now that we've covered the key components of Chapter 7, let's reflect. First, considering the distinction between communities and organizations, I can't help but wonder, should organizations try to be more like communities, or should communities look more like organizations? On the one hand, organizations can learn a lot from the shared identity and sense of belonging that communities cultivate. While, on the other hand, communities, sometimes they could use the structure, coordination, and the clarity of purpose that organizations provide. But maybe the real insight isn't choosing one over the other. It's recognizing that leadership, perhaps, lives in the tension between the two. And the best leaders know when to lean into structure and when to nurture connection, and when to set direction and when to step back and let the group's shared identity guide the way. Okay, the second reflection is related to the emic and etic approaches to leadership studies. This section made me think about all the times I've tried to understand another perspective from the outside looking in. That's the etic side at work in me. And then I think about all the times I've actually immersed myself and learned by being with people, listening and experiencing their world firsthand. That's where the emic perspective comes alive. There's a big difference between the two. And for me, this is a push to keep finding ways to step into someone else's world, rather than assuming I already get it. And honestly, that's the heart of leadership at any level, not just analyzing from a distance, but being willing to enter into the lived realities of others and let that reshape how we lead. And finally, let's reflect on the universal or globalized leadership perspective, and the localized, cross-cultural, or worldly leadership perspective. The global perspective values efficiency and sameness. Think golden arches everywhere you go, McDonald's as far as the eye can see. But the worldly perspective reminds us that leadership is always tied to place, to people, and to the context they're in. And that's powerful. For me, it's a reminder not to fall into the trap of the one-size-fits-all approach to leadership, but to stay grounded in the specifics of the people I'm leading and the situations I'm in. Okay, with these 3 reflections, I'll leave you with 3 words: belonging, immersion, and context. These are the 3 threads I want to keep pulling as we think about leadership as a practice or activity that is available to anyone at any time. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Brent's Notepad, where ideas become insight. Until next time, lead better, think deeper, and live more intentionally.